Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Come in, settle yourself, wherever you are. Let the day slide off your shoulders like a coat you no longer need to wear. Pull the blanket up. Let your breathing slow down to match the pace of my voice, which is going to be slow tonight, unhurried, the way a story ought to be when the lights are low and there is nowhere else you have to be. Tonight I want to tell you about a man who spent his whole long life doing something quiet and strange and a little frightening. He spent it looking inward, down and inward, into the dark rooms of his own mind, the way a person might go down into the cellar of an old house with a single candle, curious about what is stored down there in the dust, and half afraid of it too. His name was Carl Gustav Jung, and by the end of his 85 years, people would say that he had redrawn the map of the human soul. But before he redrew anyone else's soul, he had to go into his own. And that is really the story. That is the whole thread we will follow gently over these quiet hours. A lonely boy who carved a tiny secret figure and hid it in an attic. A grown man, broken and alone, who painted his own visions into a red leather book and then locked it away for the rest of his life. An old man who built a tower of stone with his own two hands on the shore of a lake, with no electric light in it, only firelight and well water and silence. But let us start at the very beginning. Let us start with water. The very first thing Carl Jung could remember, the earliest picture his mind had kept, was the sound of falling water. He was born on the 26th of July in the year 1875 in a small village called Keswil, in the Swiss canton of Thurgau, on the shore of a great lake called Lake Constance. But he did not stay there long enough to remember it. When he was still very small, his father was given a new post, a new parish, and the family moved to a place called Laufen, which sat beside the Rhine Falls near the town of Schaffhausen. Now, if you have never seen the Rhine Falls, let me paint them for you, softly, so you can hold the picture behind your eyes. They are the largest waterfall in all of Europe, wide and thundering, where the whole river throws itself over a ledge of rock in a churning white curtain, and the sound of it never stops. Day and night, summer and winter, that low continuous roar. It is the kind of sound that becomes part of a house, the kind of sound a small child would fall asleep to without even knowing it was there, the way you might stop hearing your own heartbeat. So the very first world that little Carl Jung knew was a world with a great weight of moving water, always at the edge of it, always speaking, always going somewhere. It settled into him early, that feeling that beneath the ordinary surface of things there is something enormous and alive and always in motion. He would spend his whole life listening for it. His father's name was Paul Achilles Jung. He was a pastor, a minister of the Reformed Church, a man who stood up on Sundays in a quiet stone church and spoke to his neighbours about God and faith and the life of the soul. And here is the first sad, tender thing about the house that Carl grew up in. His father, the pastor, the man whose entire life was built on faith, his father had lost his faith. Somewhere along the way, the living fire of it had gone out of him. He still wore the robes, he still gave the sermons, he still said all the right words about believing. But inside, the belief had quietly died, and he could not admit it, not even to himself, and certainly not to his little boy. You have to understand how strange that is for a child to grow up around. Imagine a father who is a baker but secretly cannot taste bread, a father who is a musician but can no longer hear the music. Paul Jung was, underneath, a disappointed man, a gentle and rather sorrowful man, wrestling privately with doubts he was not allowed to speak. He had been a clever young man once. He held a doctorate in Oriental languages. He could read Arabic. But the sharp, curious mind of his youth had folded itself up into a small, tired life in a country parsonage, and something in him had gone dim. Little Carl felt all of this without having the words for it. Children always do. They feel the weather in a house long before they can name it. And what young Carl felt from his father was a kind of quiet ache, a hollowness where certainty should have been. It taught him, very early, that the words people say on the surface and the truth they carry underneath are often two entirely different things. And then there was his mother. His mother was a woman named Emily Prizework, and she came from an old Basil family, a family soaked through with a fascination for the spirit world, for ghosts and premonitions and things that go bump in the night, and Emily herself was, to her son, the most mysterious person in the world. Because Carl came to feel over the years of watching her that his mother was not one person at all. She was two. There was the daytime mother, and that mother was warm and round and comfortable and ordinary. She cooked. She kept the house. She was kind, a little plump, a good motherly presence. The sort of mother who fills a kitchen with the smell of good food and makes a child feel safe. That was her number one self, you might say. Her everyday face. But there was another one. At night, or sometimes just in an unguarded moment, something else would come through her. Her voice would change. She would say things, strange, sudden, uncanny things, things that seemed to come from somewhere much older and deeper than the cheerful cook who had made his supper. She would speak with a kind of authority that did not belong to the daytime woman at all, as though a second person, a stranger, were looking out through her eyes for a moment. Jung, much later, when he was an old man remembering his childhood, called this her number two self. Her no two. Two people living in one body, a warm, familiar one for the daylight, and an uncanny, powerful, almost frightening one for the dark. Now I want you to hold on to that idea, because it is a seed. It is a small thing planted early in the boy's mind that will grow, decades later, into one of the great ideas of his whole life. This notion that a single human being might contain more than one self, a bright everyday self that shows its face to the world, and another, hidden, deeper self underneath, that only comes out in the shadows. He first met that idea, not in a book, not in a laboratory, but at his own mother's supper table, watching her voice change in the failing light. And the house he grew up in was steeped in that other world. His mother's circle, there were 8 of them, 8 members of her family and their acquaintances, would gather regularly to hold seances. Seances in those days were sittings in the dark around a table where people would try to speak with the dead, try to call spirits, try to reach across into that hidden country that the daytime world pretends is not there. This was not fringe eccentricity in that family. It was simply part of the furniture of their lives. So imagine the boy, this thoughtful, serious little boy, growing up in a house where the father wore faith like a coat that no longer fit, and the mother slipped in and out of a second uncanny self, and the aunts and cousins sat in darkened rooms trying to summon voices from beyond. He was raised right on the border between the visible and the invisible, right on the shoreline between the lit world and the dark water. And he never really left that shoreline. He built his whole life there. He was, above all, a solitary child. Lonely, you might say, though that word is not quite right, because loneliness suggests he wanted company and could not get it. It was more that he was self-contained. He lived a great deal inside his own head, in a rich, private, endlessly interesting inner world that was more real to him, more absorbing than the games of other children. He would sit for hours by himself. He would look at a stone and wonder whether he was the boy sitting on the stone, or whether he was the stone being sat upon by the boy, genuinely turning it over, that question, the way another child would turn over a marble. His mind was busy in a way that had nowhere to go but inward, and out of that inwardness came one of the most touching, most telling things he ever did as a child. A small thing, a secret thing, but it is in a way the beginning of everything. He took a wooden ruler, an ordinary school ruler, the kind any child would have in a pencil case, and from the end of it he carved a tiny little man, a mannequin, no bigger than his thumb. He whittled it into shape, gave it a little coat, and he painted it. And then he found a stone, a small oblong stone, and he painted that too, dividing it into an upper and a lower half, so that it became, in his private imagination, a kind of companion, a partner for the little wooden man. And he took these two things, the tiny carved figure and the painted stone, and he placed them together inside his pencil case in a little bed he made for them, and he carried them up to the very top of the house, to the forbidden attic, and he hid them there in a beam, in a secret spot where no one would ever find them, and he told no one, not his mother, not his father, not a single friend. This was entirely his own, a secret he kept completely. Why did he do it? He hardly knew himself at the time. He was a boy. But it gave him something that nothing else in his life gave him. Whenever he felt troubled, whenever things at home were tense, whenever his father seemed especially sad, whenever the world felt uncertain and unsafe, he would think of the little man hidden up in the attic, secure in his pencil case, and he would feel a deep, steadying calm come over him, as though somewhere in the house there was a small hidden point of safety, a secret that could not be taken from him, that belonged to him alone. Sometimes he would even write tiny messages, little scrolls in a secret language he invented, and carry them up, and place them beside the mannequin, offerings for his hidden friend. It was, in the truest sense, a private ritual, a ceremony that only he knew about, that served some deep need in him that he could not have explained. He forgot about it eventually, as children do. It slipped from his mind for years and years. But when he was a grown man, a famous man, decades later, that memory of the little carved figure came swimming back up to him. And when it did, it struck him like a bell. Because by then he had learned that people all over the world, in cultures that had never met and never spoken, had done exactly the same thing. They had carved small figures, they had made secret objects and hidden them in special places and treated them as sources of protection and power. Little gods, little companions of the soul. In ancient times, in faraway places, human beings had been carving their own version of his attic mannequin for thousands of years, out of the same nameless need, and nobody had taught them to. Nobody had taught him to. It had simply risen up out of the deep human mind, the same shape, in a Greek temple and a South Pacific hut, and a lonely Swiss boy's attic. As though the pattern was somehow already there inside all of us, waiting, but that understanding was very far away yet. For now he was only a child with a secret, and the secret comforted him, and that was enough. Now let me tell you a little about where his family came from, because it mattered to him, this sense of roots and blood and the weight of the people who came before. The Jungs were a Basel family, Basel being the old learned city on the bend of the Rhine, right where Switzerland touches France and Germany, a city of scholars and printers and doctors. His grandfather, who was also named Carl Gustav Jung, so that our Carl carried the very same name, had been a considerable man in that city, a prominent physician, a professor, even the rector, the head of the University of Basel. A large personality who cast a long shadow down the generations. And there was a rumour about that grandfather, a family legend, whispered and enjoyed and never ever proven, that this grandfather, the first Carl Gustav Jung, was in fact the illegitimate son of the great Goethe. Goethe, the towering poet of the German language, the author of Faust, the closest thing the German world had to a Shakespeare. The family half believed, or liked to half believe, that a drop of Goethe's blood ran in their veins. Now I want to be honest with you, the way a grandfather ought to be honest. There is no proof of this, none. It is a family story, the kind of golden rumour that families polish and pass around the dinner table, and young Carl grew up with it, and he rather enjoyed it, and it gave him perhaps a private sense that he was connected to something large, that great things might be expected of him, that the blood of a poet who understood the human heart might be quietly at work in him. Whether it was true matters not at all. What matters is that it was in the air he breathed as a boy. This sense of being tied to something grand and mysterious and larger than a country pastor's cramped little house by the waterfall. As he grew, this deeply inward, deeply serious boy had one more experience I should tell you about, though I want you to hear it, as he himself always insisted, as his own private account, not as a fact anyone else could check, but as a thing that happened inside the boy's own soul, and that shaped him. Around the age of 11 or 12, he had a vision, a forbidden thought, a picture that forced its way into his mind and terrified him because it seemed blasphemous, seemed like the worst sin a pastor's son could commit. He struggled against it for days, tried to push it away, sweated and suffered over it, and it was this he saw, in his mind's eye, God seated on a golden throne high above the world, above the beautiful cathedral of Basel with its bright new roof, and then, from beneath that throne, an enormous mass fell, an unspeakable falling weight, and it crashed down through the roof of the cathedral and shattered it to pieces. He was horrified. This was the God of his father, the God of the church, and here in his own head was an image of that God breaking the holiest building in the city. But when at last he let the picture come, when he stopped fighting it and let himself simply see it, something surprising happened. He did not feel damned. He felt, instead, a strange relief, a sense of grace, a feeling that he had been honest with something true rather than hiding behind something false. And he came away from it with a conviction that stayed with him always, that real religious life is not about repeating the safe, correct words the way his poor father did, but about facing the actual living images that rise up from the depths, however frightening they are. That God, or whatever we want to call that deep power, is not tame, is not only sweetness, but is a wild and overwhelming thing that will break the roofs we build to keep it out. Now again, I say this gently. This is Jung's own memory, told by an old man looking back at his boyhood in the pages of a memoir he wrote at the very end of his life. We cannot go back and verify what a child felt, but it tells us the shape of the person he was becoming. Even as a boy, he could not be content with the surface of things, with the polite agreed-upon version. He had to go under. He had to face the things that other people spent their whole lives carefully not looking at. This was his gift and his burden, both, and it was there from the start. So the boy grew. He went to school in Basel, and he was not always happy there. He was poor, the family had little money, the pastor's salary was thin, and the other boys were often the sons of wealthy families, and Karl felt the difference keenly in his worn clothes and his patched shoes. He was clever, but stubborn, thoughtful, but sometimes difficult. A boy who lived so much in his own mind that the ordinary schoolroom bored and frustrated him. He read hugely, hungrily, especially in philosophy and in the old writers who wrestled with the big questions. What is real? What is the soul? What happens when we die? And slowly, as he moved toward the age when a young man must decide what to do with his life, a hard question rose up in front of him and would not go away. What should he become? His heart was pulled in two directions, and they seemed impossible to join. On the one side, there was science, the hard, clear, respectable world of facts and measurements, and the natural world, biology, the body, medicine. He loved it. He loved the rigor of it, the way you could actually know things, actually prove them. On the other side, there was the world of the spirit, philosophy, religion, the mysteries of the soul, all the deep questions his family and his own strange childhood had steeped him in. And in those days, these two worlds seemed to have nothing to do with one another. A man of science laughed at the soul. A man of the spirit had no use for the laboratory. If you chose one, you seemed to have to give up the other entirely. And Carl Jung did not want to give up either. He could not. Both currents ran through him with equal force, and the thought of damming up one of them to let the other flow was like being asked to choose which of his own two hands to cut off. He decided, at last, to study medicine. It was the practical choice, the one that could earn a living. In 1895, at the age of 20, he entered the University of Basel, the same university where his grandfather had once been rector, as a student of medicine, and for 5 years he studied the body. Bones and blood and nerves, the machinery of the human animal. He was good at it. He was headed, most likely, toward a solid, respectable career as a surgeon or a physician of the body, a doctor of the flesh. The spiritual current in him seemed to have nowhere to go. It seemed it would have to be a private hobby, a thing he did in the evenings, forever separate from his real work. And then, near the very end of his medical studies, in his final year, something happened that changed the entire direction of his life. A small thing. The kind of small thing that turns a whole destiny, the way a single switch can send a train down an entirely different set of rails. He was studying for his final examinations, and he picked up a textbook he had put off reading, a textbook of psychiatry, by a man named Krafft-Ebing. Psychiatry, in those days, was a poor relation among the medical specialties. It was looked down upon. The other, prouder branches of medicine, surgery, internal medicine, regarded psychiatry as a murky, hopeless backwater, full of incurable madmen, locked away in asylums, a place where careers went to die. No ambitious young doctor was supposed to want it. Karl himself had not thought much about it at all. But he opened the book, and he began to read the preface, the author's opening words, before the medicine proper even started. And in that preface, Krafft-Ebing wrote something about psychiatry being, in a way, a subjective science, a science of the personality, a place where the doctor's own soul and the patient's soul meet. He wrote of the diseases of the personality as something that had to be understood from within, not just measured from without. And reading those words, Carl Jung felt his heart begin to pound. He had to get up, he had to walk about the room. Because in that instant, in a flash, The thing he had thought impossible his whole life became suddenly, blindingly possible. Here was the one field in all of medicine where his two currents could finally run together in a single channel. Psychiatry was medicine, was science, was the study of the physical brain and the sick body, and at the very same time it was the study of the soul, the mind, the spirit, the deep mysterious interior of a human being. It was the one door that opened into both rooms at once. The biological and the spiritual, the two great loves of his life that he had believed he must forever keep apart. Here they were, joined, he said later, that in that moment he knew with absolute certainty that this was his calling and no other, that everything before had been preparation for this. His teachers were astonished. His fellow students thought he was throwing his career away, choosing the despised backwater when he could have had a bright future in respectable medicine. But he knew. For once in his uncertain, doubting, divided life, he knew exactly what he was meant to do. And so, in December of the year 1900, a young Dr. Jung, 25 years old, freshly qualified, his whole life ahead of him, packed his few belongings, and he travelled to Zurich, and he took up a post as an assistant physician at a place called the Berzli. Now let me tell you what the Berzli was, because it matters. It was not some grim, forgotten madhouse on the edge of nowhere. The Berzli was the psychiatric clinic of the University of Zurich, one of the finest, most forward-thinking mental hospitals in the whole of Europe. This was the front line of the science of the mind. And the man who ran it, the director under whom young Jung came to work, was a remarkable physician named Eugen Bleuler. You may not know the name, but you almost certainly know two words that Bleuler gave to the world. He was the man who coined the term schizophrenia, the splitting of the mind. And he was the man who coined the word autism. These are words we still use every single day, more than 100 years later. So Jung was not off in some backwater at all. He had placed himself at the very centre of the serious scientific study of the human mind, working directly under one of its great pioneers. And the Berzli was a serious place. Bleuler ran it with an almost monkish discipline. The young doctors lived on the premises, practically inside the hospital, sharing the life of the institution. There was no alcohol allowed. The doors were locked at a certain hour. The work was constant, demanding, intimate. The young physicians lived alongside their patients, ate near them, walked the corridors with them, learned to see them not as hopeless cases to be filed away, but as human beings whose disordered minds might, if you looked and listened carefully enough, actually be trying to say something. Bleuler had a revolutionary idea for that time, the idea that even the ravings of the most disturbed patient, the wildest word salad of the most broken mind, was not just noise, that there might be meaning in it, that if you paid close enough attention, patiently enough, humbly enough, the madness itself had a logic, had a story it was trying to tell. And this, for Carl Jung, was the perfect soil. Here was a young man who from earliest childhood had believed that beneath the surface of things there is always something deeper trying to speak. The roar of the falls beneath the quiet house, the no-to self beneath his mother's cheerful daylight face, the secret mannequin hidden in the attic beam, the shattering image beneath the safe words of the church. And now he found himself in a place, a serious scientific place, whose whole method was to listen for exactly that. To lean in close to the broken and the disturbed and the lost, and to ask, not how do we silence this, but what is it trying to say? He threw himself into it completely. He worked enormous hours. He observed his patients with a patience and a tenderness that some of the other doctors found excessive, sitting with them, listening to them, trying to enter the strange countries of their damaged minds and find the sense hidden inside the nonsense. He kept careful notes. He watched. He listened. And already, in these first years at the Burgulzli, the young man was beginning to circle around the great questions that would occupy the rest of his life. Not the questions of the surface, not merely what is wrong with this person's brain, but the deeper questions. What is hidden in the human mind, beneath the part we know? What lives down there, in the cellar, in the dark, below the little lit room of everyday awareness that we think of as ourselves? And how could a doctor find a way to actually reach it, to measure it, to bring it up into the light where it could be seen? He did not know it yet, sitting in that disciplined hospital in those first winter months of the new century, a poor pastor's son far from the thundering falls of his childhood. But he was standing at the beginning of a road that would take him further inward and further down than perhaps anyone before him had deliberately gone. He was about to invent a way to measure the invisible, a way to catch, in a flicker of hesitation and a bead of sweat on the skin, the hidden wounds that people carry and cannot speak of. And that discovery would carry his name across the world, and would lead him in time to the door of the most famous mind doctor alive, a man in Vienna named Sigmund Freud, and to a friendship, and then to a break, that would nearly cost Carl Jung his own sanity. But all of that is still ahead of us. For now, hold the picture of the young man at the start of it all. December 1900. The lamps lit in the long corridors of the Burgulzli, the patients in their rooms, and a serious, watchful, deeply inward young doctor, 25 years old, who has finally, after all his years of division and doubt, found the one place in the whole world where his two hearts could beat as one. Sitting down at his desk, opening his notebook, beginning to listen. The test began, as many of the most important things do, with something very simple, a word, just a word, spoken aloud into the quiet of a room. And then a wait, a listening, a watching. Jung had learned the technique from others before him, and there was nothing new about the idea itself. Word association had been practiced in psychological circles for years, a parlour game of the mind, really, where you say a word and the person across from you says the first word that comes back to them. Apple, and they say red. House, and they say warm. Clock, and they say, and here they hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, just a hair's breadth, longer than they should, and then they say broken. And they don't quite meet your eyes. That hesitation, that was what interested Jung. Not the word that came back, though that mattered too, but the gap between the word going out and the word returning. Because a mind with nothing to hide would respond quickly and smoothly, the way water flows over a clear stone riverbed. But a mind with something buried in it, something charged and painful and pressed down under the surface of ordinary awareness, would catch on that buried thing the way water catches on a hidden rock. Just for an instant. A small, almost invisible turbulence on the surface. A fractional delay. A stumble. A cough. An unexpected word, a repeated word. The forgetting of the word they'd already given. These small disturbances were what Jung set himself to measure with a precision that no one before him had quite attempted. He was methodical about it in the way the Burgulzli trained its staff to be methodical. This was a serious hospital, a research hospital, and Eugen Bleuler expected his physicians to do science, not speculation. So Jung did science. He sat across from patient after patient, and he read them a prepared list of stimulus words, 100 words, carefully chosen, and he noted not only what they said in response, but how long it took them to say it. He used a stopwatch. He measured in fractions of a second. He watched the breathing. He observed whether their hands moved, whether their eyes shifted, whether a flush moved up into the face, or the voice dropped, or the answer came out slightly too loud, slightly too emphatic, as though they were trying, without knowing they were trying, to push something down. And then there was the galvanic skin response. This is a delicate instrument for measuring something the body does without permission. The tiny electrical change in the skin's conductance when a person experiences emotional arousal, a change caused by the faintest activation of the sweat glands. Not a noticeable sweat, not the kind you dab away. Something far subtler than that, a whisper of moisture. The body confessing what the mouth would not. Jung connected his subjects to this device and watched the needle while he spoke his words, and what he saw confirmed what the stopwatch was already telling him. Certain words caused a surge, a visible spike in that needle, a betrayal registered in electrical current on the skin. And those words, when he traced them back and looked at the whole constellation of a patient's responses, when he mapped the delays and the stumbles and the unexpected answers onto a kind of invisible landscape, he found that they clustered. They gathered. They formed groups around certain themes, certain memories, certain feelings that the patient in question had never consciously connected, had perhaps never articulated even to themselves. A woman might stumble on the word needle, and again on the word blame, and again on something as seemingly innocent as the word thread. And when you looked at all three together, and at the way she had flushed and looked away, and at the 4/10 of a second that should have been 1/10, you began to see the outline of something she had not told you, a story she was carrying, a wound she had been pressing on for so long she had forgotten she was pressing on it. Jung called these constellations feeling-toned complexes. That was his term, and it is a beautifully precise one. A complex, in his use of the word, was not a neurosis or a disease or a defect. It was simply a knot, a cluster of memories, images, emotions, and thoughts that had gathered around some emotionally charged experience and become bound together, charged with a kind of psychic electricity that gave them a weight and a gravity out of all proportion to what the person's rational mind would assign them. You could be, in every observable way, a perfectly composed and reasonable adult and still be carrying a complex about your mother, or about a humiliation you suffered at 12 years old, or about a loss that you'd decided, years ago, was simply past and done with. The complex did not care what you had decided. It sat in its corner of the unconscious and exerted its pull, and when a word happened to brush against it, needle, blame, thread, it tugged on the stopwatch needle and on the galvanic sensor and on the slight unwillingness in your eyes. This was a scientific discovery. Genuinely scientific, in the sense that it was repeatable, measurable, falsifiable, grounded in observable physical data. Other physicians at other hospitals could run the same test, and they did, and they got the same kinds of results. The word association test under Jung's particular development became not just a clinical curiosity, but a real tool, one of the earliest reliable methods for detecting the presence of unconscious emotional material, and you can draw a line, a long and winding but continuous line. From those sessions in the Berkeley in the early 1900s all the way forward to something as familiar today as a lie detector, which operates on very similar principles. The body knows what the mind is hiding. The body will always, eventually, tell. Jung published his studies between 1904 and 1907, and they made his reputation. Not just within Switzerland, not just at the Berkeley, but across the wider world of medical psychology. Here was a young doctor with real data, measurable data, doing something that bridged the laboratory and the clinic. He was taken seriously in a way that some others working in similar territory, deeper, more speculative territory, were not always taken. And during those same years, two other things were happening in Carl Jung's life that were equally important, though quieter in their way, and both deserve a gentle word here. The first was a marriage. In 1903, a year before the word association studies began earning him wider notice, Jung married Emma Rauschenbach. She came from one of the most prosperous families in Switzerland. Her father owned the IWC watch manufactory in Schaffhausen, the same city, you may remember, where the Rhine falls thunder over their stones, and the Rauschenbach family had the kind of settled, generations-deep wealth that was as different from the modest pastor's son circumstances of Jung's upbringing as a still lake is from a rushing river. Emma was not merely wealthy. She was intelligent, quietly serious, with a quality of attentiveness that would serve her well in the work she would eventually do in her own right. Because Emma did not simply become a doctor's wife and stop there. Over the decades, she would study and practice as an analyst herself, and she would write with careful scholarship on the legend of the Grail, and on the figures of the animus and the anima, concepts that, as we will see, would become central to her husband's unfolding system of thought. They would have 5 children. They would remain together until her death in 1955. And the marriage, among other things, freed Jung in a practical way that should not be underestimated. It gave him financial security, the kind of cushion that allowed him, in later years when he was doing work that bewildered and alienated many of his colleagues, to simply continue, to keep going, to build, literally and figuratively, what he needed to build. The second thing from those years is more delicate and on a channel like this one, where we come to rest rather than to be agitated. It is a thing to speak of carefully. In 1904, a 19-year-old woman named Sabina Spielrein was admitted to the Berkeley. She had come from Russia, from a Russian Jewish family, and she was in a serious state of psychological disturbance. Jung treated her. She improved. She eventually became a physician herself, and then a psychoanalyst, one of the first women to work in that young field. And she would go on to develop ideas about a kind of destructive drive that would wind its way, through the exchanges of that early psychoanalytic world, into the thinking of Sigmund Freud himself. The relationship between Jung and Spielrein became entangled in ways that were professionally and personally complicated, and there were letters, and there were difficulties. And the full truth of it is something historians have pieced together carefully from documents that were not found until decades later. Her diary was rediscovered in Geneva in 1977, and it is part of the human record. It matters, because it was real. But what matters most for our purposes here tonight is simply that Sabina Spielrein was a remarkable mind who emerged from great difficulty to contribute genuinely and seriously to a field that was still finding its footing, and that her story is part of the story of those early years at the Berkeley when Jung was doing some of the most audacious scientific work of his life. Now, the word association studies. The published papers, the reputation travelling outward from Zurich across Europe, carried along the networks of academic correspondence and medical journals, and the particular excitement that moves through any young field when someone has done something that feels genuinely new. It reached Vienna. It reached a man who was himself already famous or already notorious, the line between those two things being narrower than it looks, for his own explorations of the unconscious. A doctor, a neurologist by training, who had spent years constructing a theory of the mind that was, to put it plainly, unlike anything that had come before it. His name was Sigmund Freud. Freud had been reading Jung's work, and Jung had been reading Freud's, and there was a recognition in it that must have felt, for both of them, like the particular relief of being seen. Freud's ideas about the unconscious, about repression, about dreams as the coded language of buried wishes, were bold and controversial and widely dismissed, and he was hungry for allies. Especially allies who came with scientific credentials, with clinical evidence, with numbers from a stopwatch and readings from a galvanic device. Jung's word association studies were, in a sense, exactly that, empirical corroboration that the unconscious contained what Freud said it contained. That beneath the surface of a person's mind. Below what they knew and said and believed about themselves, there was another country, unmapped and powerful, with its own weather and its own logic. They began to correspond, letters moving between Vienna and Zurich, careful at first, then less careful, then warm. And then Jung went to Vienna. The date was March 1907. Jung travelled from Zurich to Vienna to meet Freud in person for the first time, and they sat together in Freud's apartment, surrounded by his famous collection of antiquities, the small statues and figures from ancient cultures that Freud gathered and kept, and that were, for him, not merely decorative, but emblematic of his entire project, the archaeology of buried things, and they talked. They talked for 13 hours. This is the figure that has come down to us, and whether it is exactly 13 or 12 or 14 hardly matters. What matters is the quality of it, the unbroken intensity. Two minds circling a shared territory from different angles, and finding again and again that they were describing the same landscape in different languages. Freud, 20 years older, already the established master of a school of thought he had founded largely alone in the face of considerable resistance and ridicule. Jung, younger, Swiss, academically credentialed in ways that Freud was aware mattered to the European scientific establishment in ways that his own Viennese Jewish identity did not. In those particular times, and in those particular professional circles, always help. That is a thing to say plainly, because Freud himself said it plainly. He was aware, and he was not naive about, the way the world of early 20th century European medicine looked at certain kinds of people. He had worked hard his whole life in the face of that awareness. And when he saw in Jung someone who might carry psychoanalysis forward into the academies, into the hospitals, into the broader international medical community, he felt something that went beyond intellectual admiration. He felt, perhaps, the particular hope of a man who has been building something important in relative isolation, and who sees at last someone who might help him build it further than he could reach alone. He called Jung his crown prince, his heir, the one who would carry the work forward. This was an enormous weight to place on a friendship, as it turned out. But in the beginning, in the flush of that 13-hour conversation in Vienna in 1907, none of that weight was yet visible. There was only the conversation itself and the warmth of two people discovering that they were both, in their different ways, devoted to the same central mystery, what the mind keeps from itself, and what happens when those secrets are brought carefully into the light. Jung returned to Zurich changed. Not converted, he was never simply Freud's student. And even in those early years of admiration there were places where his thinking ran in directions that Freud's did not. But energized, connected, part of something larger than the corridors of the Berzli. He threw himself into the work of the growing psychoanalytic movement. He participated in its meetings, its correspondence, its building of an international community of practitioners and researchers. And Freud, for his part, turned to Jung again and again, in letters, in conversations when they met, in the daily weight of the movement's direction, as someone whose judgment and energy he could rely on. In 1909, they sailed to America together. The occasion was an honorary degree at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was a significant moment, the first major American recognition of psychoanalysis. An invitation that meant the ideas these two men had been developing in European offices and clinics were beginning to be taken seriously across the Atlantic. They travelled by ocean liner, Freud and Jung, and the Viennese analyst Sndor Ferenczi, and during the crossing they analysed each other's dreams. This is the kind of detail that makes you smile a little if you close your eyes and picture it, the three of them on the deck of a ship, somewhere on the grey Atlantic, trading the contents of their sleeping minds the way other travellers might trade postcards. What a strange and earnest thing to do. What a particular combination of professional dedication and human curiosity. But there were tensions already in that ocean crossing, small and unremarked on at the time, that would grow. Freud had a dream, and when Jung asked about it, pressed for the personal associations that would allow a proper analysis, Freud drew back. He said, and this is the account that has survived, that he could not risk his authority by sharing too much of himself. Jung registered this. He felt it as a kind of door-closing, a limit built into the friendship from the beginning, an inequality that could not quite be acknowledged openly, but that was there nonetheless, patient and eventual. The elder would not fully submit to the younger's gaze, even while expecting the younger to submit to his. The American visit was a success. Publicly, Freud and Jung gave their lectures. The honorary degrees were conferred. The ideas were introduced to a new continent's intellectual life in a way that would matter enormously for decades to come. And then they sailed home, back across the Atlantic, back to their separate cities. Freud to Vienna, Jung to Zurich and Emma and the Berzli and the word association studies and the correspondence that had become, by now, a constant stream of letters, several a week, back and forth. In 1910, the International Psychoanalytical Association was formally established, and Carl Gustav Jung was named its first president. He was 34 years old. The appointment was Freud's doing, and it reflected the depth of Freud's investment in him, the sense that here was the man who would give the movement its future. Jung accepted and took the role seriously and edited the yearbook and corresponded with analysts across Europe and worked to build what was, in effect, a new institution, a new professional community, out of something that had until recently been a loose network of interested physicians clustering around a single charismatic thinker in Vienna. It was a great deal of responsibility for a young man who was simultaneously running a psychiatric clinic, practicing as a physician, pursuing his own research, maintaining a marriage and a growing family, and carrying on an enormous correspondence that touched on nearly every dimension of mind and culture and medicine and myth. And beneath all of it, below the organizational work and the professional commitments and the role of Crown Prince, something else was happening in Jung's thinking, something that he had not yet found the right words for. something that the word association studies had pointed toward but not yet reached, something that lay further back and further down than the feeling-toned complexes of individual patients. He was beginning to see things in his patients' dreams and fantasies, images, symbols, figures. That seemed to come from somewhere older and wider than any individual life. A patient who had never studied mythology would produce, in their deepest distress, imagery that seemed to echo ancient stories. A symbol that appeared in one place, and time would surface, in almost identical form, somewhere else entirely unconnected. There was a feeling, difficult to articulate but impossible for Jung to dismiss, that the unconscious was not merely personal. That below the layer of buried individual memories and compressed individual wounds, there was something else, something shared, something that preceded the individual, the way a riverbed precedes any particular water that happens to flow through it. But that was a thought that could not yet be said, not openly, not in the company of Sigmund Freud. Because Freud's model of the unconscious was at bottom personal, biographical. What was buried in you had been buried during your lifetime, in infancy, in childhood, in the shocks and confusions of your individual development. It was rooted in your particular experience of your particular body and your particular parents and your particular desires. Freud's great, austere, Darwinian commitment was to the biological. And the more Jung looked at the material coming out of his patients, and the more he read in myth and religion and anthropology and the history of symbolic thought across cultures, the more he found himself pulling against that commitment, wanting to reach somewhere that Freud's map did not include. He had also begun to feel, with increasing clarity, that Freud's insistence on sexual energy as the fundamental driver of the unconscious was too narrow. Not wrong, exactly. There was something real there, something Freud had genuinely seen, but insufficient. A partial map of larger territory. What if libido, that word Freud used for the psychic energy that drives us, the fuel of desire and motivation and attachment, was not primarily sexual? What if it was something broader? A general life energy, protean and multiple, that could express itself sexually, yes, but could also express itself as curiosity, as aggression, as religious devotion, as artistic creation, as the urge to build and make and know? What if the sexual was one of its rivers, not the whole ocean? These were the questions that were moving in Jung's mind in those years around 1910 and 1911, as he sat in his Zurich study in the evenings after the clinical days were done, reading widely in a way that already set him apart from most of his psychoanalytic colleagues, reading mythology, reading ancient texts, reading comparative religion, reading the records of other cultures' inner lives. He had always been like this, had always had this almost voracious appetite for the symbolic and the historical and the mythological, all the way back to the basal years and the reading he had done as a boy. And now that reading was converging with his clinical experience in a way that was producing ideas he could not quite contain within the framework Freud had built, he began to write them down. He began to write a book. It was called Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido. In English, when it was first translated, it was rendered as Psychology of the Unconscious, and later, after Jung had revised it substantially in his maturity, it became Symbols of Transformation. It was published in 1912. And it was, in the most precise sense, the book that changed everything between them. Because in that book, Jung did what he had been circling toward doing for years. He argued, clearly and in print, that libido was not primarily sexual energy, but a broader psychic energy, a general vital force, He analyzed ancient myths and religious imagery and showed how they appeared in nearly identical forms across cultures that could never have known each other, and he argued that this cross-cultural recurrence was not coincidence, but evidence of something universal in the human psyche. Some inherited patterning that expressed itself in symbolic form wherever human minds dreamed or imagined or created. He took seriously, as something meaningful rather than merely pathological, the religious and mythological dimensions of human experience that Freud tended to treat as symptoms to be explained away. Freud read it, and the friendship began, very quietly, to end. Not all at once, not in a single confrontation, not in a slammed door or a shouted accusation. It was slower than that, and, in some ways, worse, a gradual cooling, a growing formality in the letters, a sense of two men who had once spoken freely now, choosing their words with the particular care of people who have begun to fear what the other might hear in them. There had already been small breaks in the surface. Freud had fainted, actually lost consciousness for a moment, in Jung's presence at a dinner in Bremen in 1909, before their Atlantic crossing. It happened again at a gathering in Munich in 1912. These episodes are in the record, and they were strange enough that both men knew it, strange enough that they spoke of them, though they could not agree on what they meant. Jung, in the analytical spirit of his training, looked at them as significant, as the body confessing something the mind was struggling to contain. Freud explained them differently. The interpretations diverged, as everything was now beginning to diverge. The letters became less frequent. When they did come, they had a tone of managed distance, of two people maintaining, by mutual and unspoken agreement, the appearance of collegiality, because the alternative, the explicit acknowledgement of how far they had drifted, was too costly to face directly. And beneath the managed distance, on both sides, something was hardening into hurt. Because for Freud, this was not merely a professional disagreement. He had invested in Jung. He had given him the crown prince title, the presidency, the weight of a future he wanted very much to see. He had, in a way that perhaps went beyond what was quite wise, placed his hopes for the movement's survival and expansion on this one man's shoulders. And now that man was writing books that undermined the foundation of what the movement was built on. It felt, from Freud's side, like betrayal. Whatever the intellectual merits of Jung's arguments, and Freud thought they were wrong, the emotional fact of it was betrayal. And for Jung it was different, but not simpler. He had genuinely admired Freud. He had learned from him. The 13-hour conversation in Vienna in 1907 had been real, that intensity, that recognition, the sense of two people finding each other across the isolation that any serious and unconventional thinker lives with. And now he was having to choose between the friendship and the truth of what he was actually seeing in his work, in his patience, in his reading. Between the relationship that had meant so much to him and the intellectual honesty that he felt, perhaps more than anything else, was his deepest obligation. He could not unsee what he had seen. He could not stop thinking what he was thinking. And he was beginning to understand that those two things, the friendship and the thinking, could not, in the end, both survive. In January of 1913, the personal relationship between Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud came to an end. And by 1914, Jung had resigned from the International Psychoanalytical Association and from its presidency. The community he had been part of, the professional world, the network of colleagues and correspondents and allies, the whole structure of belonging that the psychoanalytic movement had given him, was gone. The crown he had been offered and worn had been set down. He was alone again. Alone in a way he had not been since before Vienna, before the 13-hour conversation, before the ship to America. But the loneliness ahead of him was of a different order entirely from anything he had yet known, because it was not only professional. What was coming for Carl Jung in the years after the break, the thing waiting for him in those years between 1913 and roughly 1917, was a descent, a going down into the interior of himself that was more thorough, more frightening, more deliberate, and ultimately more fruitful than anything the word association studies or the Berkeley or even the friendship with Freud had prepared him for. He was about to do something that few people have ever done, or would even think to do. He was about to walk deliberately into his own darkness and keep walking, not to escape it, not to suppress it, but to meet it, to learn its language, to find out what lived in the places he had spent a lifetime circling from a safe distance. The inner voices were already getting louder, the dreams more insistent, the boundary between what he had always called his no-one self, the rational, professional, outward-facing physician, and the other one, the one that had carved a tiny mannequin from a ruler in a Swiss attic and hidden it with a painted stone and told no one. That boundary was beginning, slowly but unmistakably, to thin. Something was pressing up from below. He had been building toward this book for years without quite knowing it. The ideas that would become Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido had been gathering in him since long before the break with Freud, gathering like weather gathers, quietly, at the edges of the sky, while the sun still shines in the center. Jung had been reading myths. He had been reading the old stories, the ancient ones from Egypt and Greece and India and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, reading them not as a scholar collecting curiosities, but as a physician trying to understand something his patients were showing him that he could not yet name. Over and over again, in the fantasies and dreams and breakdown material of the men and women who came to the Berkeley, he was finding images that had no obvious personal source. Imagery that matched, with sometimes uncanny precision, motifs that appeared in myths from cultures those patients had never studied, never read, would not have recognized if shown them. It was as if something older than memory was speaking in the language of dream, and he wanted to understand what that something was. The book he wrote to hold these ideas, the 1912 work he called Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, which would later be translated into English as Psychology of the Unconscious and, years further on, after significant revision, as Symbols of Transformation, was the book that ended the friendship with Freud. And it ended it for a reason that was not petty. It ended it because the book contained a genuine and fundamental disagreement, one that could not be smoothed over or delayed any longer. The disagreement was about a word that Freud had given a very specific meaning, and that Jung now proposed to open much wider. The word was libido. For Freud, libido was, at its core, sexual energy. It was the drive, the biological push of the body toward pleasure and reproduction, and he saw it as the engine behind most of what the mind does. Repression, neurosis, the whole complicated machinery of the unconscious was, in his view, largely organized around what we do with that sexual energy when society tells us we cannot express it directly. It was a powerful idea. It explained a great deal. Jung had worked within it for years. But now, reading these myths, sitting with these patients, turning the material over and over in his mind in the quiet evenings after the clinic closed, now Jung felt, with a certainty he could not dismiss, that the theory was too small for what he was actually seeing. that sexual energy was not nothing, that it was real and important, but that it was one expression of something larger, something he wanted to call psychic energy, a broader life force, a general vitality of the soul that expressed itself as sexuality but also as curiosity and creativity and religious feeling and the hunger to build and to understand and to connect. The way light through a prism spreads into many colors, he thought libido might be something like that undivided light, and sexuality one of its colors, brilliant and important, but not the only one. Imagine it this way. A river does not only flow in one direction and for one purpose. It carves channels, it feeds meadows, it turns mill wheels, it reflects the sky. It carries boats and fish and fallen leaves and the first light of morning. You would not say a river's only purpose is to reach the sea, and yet insist this is the complete account of what a river is. Jung felt Freud had done something similar with the energy of the human mind, had located it precisely, had measured part of its course accurately, but had mistaken one channel for the whole of the river. He wrote this in the book, carefully, respectfully, with extensive citation and argument, but clearly. And he knew as he was writing it what it would cost him. He admitted as much later. He sent sections of the manuscript to Freud in advance, chapter by chapter, the way you might show a dangerous thing to someone you love before setting it in motion, hoping for something, understanding perhaps, or at least a conversation. What came back was increasing coldness. Freud saw the redefinition of libido not as a theoretical extension, but as an abandonment. And perhaps more than that, perhaps as a kind of disloyalty. A breaking of ranks at exactly the moment when the movement he had built needed its ranks unbroken. The book was published. The letters between them grew fewer. The warmth drained out. And then, in January of 1913, came the letter that ended it. Jung wrote to Freud proposing that they abandon their personal relationship, that they continue only as professional colleagues, if at all. Freud's reply was brief. He said there was nothing to object to. And that was that. 13 years. No, not 13 years, but the weight and texture and meaning of what had been built in those 6 years, since March 1907. Since the 13 hours of uninterrupted conversation, since the ship across the Atlantic and the honorary degrees and the presidency and the crown prince and all of it, all of that came to a quiet, irrevocable stop. In 1914, Jung resigned the presidency of the International Psychoanalytical Association. The organization he had helped build, had led, had shaped, now simply did not include him. He was not expelled. He chose to go. But the distinction in the quiet of a Swiss evening must not have felt like much. He was 38 years old. He had a wife and children and a house on the lake at Kschnacht. He had a private practice and a reputation, though the reputation was now contested, shaded, complicated by the rupture. He was not destitute. He was not without resources. But the professional world he had inhabited, the conferences and the journals and the collegial letters and the shared sense of working toward something, the human web of belonging that came with being part of a movement, that world had closed around the space where he had stood and left him outside it. And into that silence, the interior world began to speak more loudly. This is the part of Jung's life that is the hardest to describe, simply because it is the most unusual, the most unlike what we expect a man of science to do when things fall apart. Most people, losing what Jung lost, would have doubled down on the visible, on the work, on building something new and recognizable, would have returned to the laboratory bench, the lecture hall, the publishable, would have found their footing again in the concrete and the measurable. Jung did the opposite. He turned toward the darkness. He called it, later, his confrontation with the unconscious. He used that word deliberately and precisely, confrontation, not exploration, not study, but confrontation. Because what he was about to do felt to him not like a scholarly inquiry, but like meeting something in a corridor you cannot avoid, something that has been waiting at the far end of that corridor for a very long time. He had always had two selves, remember, the no one self and the no two self, the physician and the boy in the attic. The rational, outward-facing man who ran clinics and wrote papers and shook hands with Sigmund Freud, and the other one, the quieter and stranger one, the one who had carved a tiny figure from a ruler in childhood and felt, without being able to say why, that the figure mattered enormously. Now, with the professional structure stripped away, with the relationship that had helped organize so much of the last 6 years simply gone, the no-two self was not content to stay in the attic anymore. It had things to show him. The first sign came in October of 1913. He was travelling by train when the vision came upon him. It was not a dream. He was awake, sitting in an ordinary railway compartment, looking out at the ordinary landscape. And then he was not. In his vision, he saw a flood covering the northern lowlands of Europe, a monstrous inundation, advancing from the north, drowning everything in its path. He saw the yellow water, the debris, the floating rubble of civilization. He saw the sea turn blood red. Thousands of bodies, drowned. The vision lasted perhaps an hour, and when it passed he sat in the railway compartment in a cold sweat, badly shaken. He did not know what to make of it. The obvious fear, the fear that struck him first and most forcefully, was that he was losing his mind, that the vision was a symptom. A psychiatrist knows the vocabulary of breakdown better than most people, knows exactly which words go with which kinds of deterioration, and Jung knew that what he had just experienced bore some resemblance to material he had seen in psychotic patients at the Bergsley. The thought was not comfortable. He was, after all, a man who had spent years helping other people navigate the boundary between sanity and its dissolution. The possibility that he was now standing at that boundary himself, that the loneliness and the loss and the years of building and then losing had pushed him somewhere fragile, this was a genuinely frightening thing to sit with on a Swiss train in October. The vision came again. Twice more over the following weeks, with variants, always the flood, always the catastrophe, always the blood. And then, in the summer of 1914, the war that would come to be called the First World War began in earnest, and Europe was indeed drowning in blood, and more people would die in that conflict than any previous war in the history of the continent. Jung later read the visions as a premonition. He was careful about this, careful in the way a trained physician is careful about interpreting his own material. He did not claim to have foreseen the war in any mystical sense, but he noted that the unconscious, which absorbs an enormous amount that the conscious mind does not explicitly register, may have been processing signals about the political and social catastrophe building across Europe long before his rational mind had assembled them into a coherent picture. The unconscious dreams what the conscious mind has not yet dared to know. Whether you accept that reading or prefer a more straightforward psychological one, the visions as an expression of profound anxiety, of a world coming apart both inside and outside him, the effect of realizing the images were not madness, but meaning was significant. If these were not symptoms of personal breakdown but something else, something that pointed outward as well as inward, then perhaps the descent he was being called toward was not something to fight off, Perhaps it was something to follow. He began to follow it deliberately, carefully, with the trained attention of a physician watching a procedure, even when the procedure was happening inside himself. He developed what he would later name active imagination. The technique was essentially this: he would sit quietly, in the evenings usually, and allow himself to enter a kind of waking reverie, a state partway between ordinary consciousness and sleep, not forcing the images, not directing them, simply attending, the way you might attend to a fire without trying to control where the flames move. And in that state, figures would arise, inner figures with their own voices and their own logic and their own peculiar insistence. And rather than dismissing them as random neural noise, Jung would engage with them. He would speak to them, he would write down what they said, he would argue with them, question them, follow them into whatever territory they wanted to show him. It sounds, described that plainly, like something a reader might find alarming. A psychiatrist talking to imaginary figures in the dark. But the key word, the word that separates what Jung was doing from what he feared it resembled, was deliberate. He was choosing to enter and choosing to leave. The door was one he controlled. He was not being swept away, he was swimming down on purpose, with a rope attached so he could find his way back. The rope was his family, his house, his patients, the ordinary daily life of a practicing physician that continued through all of this. Every morning he saw patients, every evening he returned to the inner work. The two worlds ran in parallel, and he moved between them like a man who has learned to breathe underwater without forgetting that air also exists. Among the figures that arose in these sessions, one appeared again and again with a particular authority. Jung called him Wilhelm. Wilhelm was an old man with the wings of a kingfisher, that particular iridescent blue-green, the colour of shallow water over white sand, shot through with orange. He had the horns of a bull. He carried 4 keys. He appeared in Jung's inner visions with the unhurried presence of someone who has been waiting to be found, and he spoke in ways that surprised Jung, not because the words were shocking or bizarre, but because they were wiser than anything Jung felt he could have produced from his own thinking. Wilhelm said things Jung had not considered, offered perspectives Jung had not arrived at, followed lines of reasoning to conclusions that felt genuinely new. And this, for Jung, was the crucial observation, the thing that would eventually anchor one of his most important theoretical distinctions. Wilhelm was not simply a part of Jung that Jung already knew. He was, in some functional sense, autonomous. He thought his own thoughts. He had his own point of view. He was not a mirror, he was a presence. Whether you believe that this makes Wilhelm literally real, or whether you understand him as a region of the unconscious mind large enough and organized enough to behave as if it were a separate intelligence, the practical fact, the experiential fact, was that Jung was in relationship with something inside himself that he did not fully own or control. He treated Wilhelm as a teacher. He walked with him, in imagination, in the garden at Snacht, and he listened. Later he would say that Wilhelm represented superior insight and that their conversations clarified things that his own conscious thinking had only circled. He recognized in this, looking back, something like what the ancient world had called a daemon, the inner guiding voice, the figure Socrates described, the thing the Romans called a genius in its original sense, the spiritual companion that was not quite identical to the self. Salome was also there in those years, and a figure Jung called Elijah. The inner world was populated, lit by a light that did not come from outside. And Jung, the scientist, the man who had measured galvanic skin response and reaction times, and brought empirical rigor to the study of the unconscious, this same man sat in the evenings in his house by the lake and wrote down what the winged old man with the kingfisher wings said to him. He was keeping records. He had always kept records. The scientist in him would not stop noting things down, even when what he was noting was this strange and this private. He had small journals, notebooks in a dark cover that he carried through those years. Into them he wrote what he saw, what the figures said, what the visions showed him, what questions he asked, and what answers came back. He drew in them. He painted in them, the image and the word side by side, the way a naturalist might record a new species. Here is what it looks like, and here is what it does, and here is what I think it means. These notebooks he later called the Black Books. And it was from the Black Books, over years of returning to the material and working with it, that something else slowly grew. He had a large book made, a folio bound in red leather, a deep, dark, burnished red, the colour of old garnets, the colour of certain autumn sunsets over still water. The book was handsome and substantial, the kind of object that signals from across a room that it contains something important. Its pages were fine. And into this book, working slowly and with enormous care, Jung began to transcribe the material from the Black Books, but not simply transcribe. He worked it, he illuminated it. He wrote in a calligraphic hand, a hand he had deliberately trained toward the medieval, toward the great illuminated manuscripts of Europe's monastic centuries, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells. The gorgeous, patient labour of men who believed they were writing the Word of God and gave the work accordingly everything they had. His hand moved across the pages with that same quality of attention. And he painted. Between the passages of text and throughout the margins and across full pages, he painted images from the visions. Mandalous, circular, symmetrical, elaborately detailed symbolic compositions that he had begun drawing almost involuntarily during this period, waking in the mornings with an urge to draw a circle and fill it, feeling each day's mandala somehow corresponded to his inner state that day, the way a barometer corresponds to the weather. Figures from the visions, Philemon with his wings, his keys, his bovine horns. Landscapes of an inner world that had no geography on any map but felt, somehow, entirely real. Serpents and suns and moons and towers and waters that were not the water of Lake Zurich but something older and stranger. He lettered the title in that same careful medieval script, Liber Novus, the new book, though almost no one would know that title for decades, because almost no one would see the book. He called it, too, the Red Book, the red leather book, the book the colour of garnets and autumn and certain particular depths of evening sky. He worked on it for years, from 1913 into the 1920s, and with diminishing intensity into the late 1920s and the turn of the 1930s. He added to it, he returned to it, he put it down for months, and then opened it again. It was the record of a passage, the passage, and he was not sure, for a long time, when the passage would end, or what it meant, or whether he had crossed through to whatever was on the other side. The working of the Red Book was not a project with a deadline. It was more like a long illness that was also, somehow, a long education, a fever that contained its own learning. He did not show it to anyone. This requires a moment's pause to let it settle, because it is genuinely remarkable. Here was a man who had made his reputation through publication, through rigorous public argument, through the meticulous presentation of evidence and theory to the scrutiny of colleagues and critics. Here was a man who had sent drafts of his books to Freud in advance, chapter by chapter, seeking the engagement of another mind. And the work that was, by his own later assessment, the most important thing he ever produced, the source material from which everything else he did would eventually be quarried, this work he kept locked away. He showed it to almost no one in his lifetime. He did not prepare it for publication. He placed it, when he was done, in a vault, a bank vault in Zurich. And there it sat. Not for a decade, for nearly half a century. The Red Book stayed in that vault through the years of building the concepts, through the writing of psychological types, and the long essays on archetypes, and the decades of clinical work, and the founding of the Institute, and the field work in America and Africa and India, and the slow accrual of worldwide reputation. Through Emma's lifetime, through his own long old age, through his death in 1961. It sat in the vault through the years that other thinkers were reading his published work and building on it and arguing with it. It sat in the vault while the ideas it had generated were becoming part of the language, while shadow and archetype and individuation were passing from technical vocabulary into everyday speech. It sat in the vault while the century turned and the world changed in ways Jung had not imagined and could not have. It was not published until 2009, 48 years after Jung's death. Edited with tremendous scholarly care by a historian named Sonu Shamdasani, who had spent years working with the Jung family and the archive and the difficult, layered question of what the Red Book was and how it should be brought into the world. When it was finally published, as a large format facsimile, the pages photographed in full colour so that the paintings and the calligraphy could be seen as Jung had made them, it was the kind of publishing event that surprises everyone, including publishers. It sold out immediately. It was reprinted. People who had never read a page of analytical psychology and had only the haziest notion of who Jung was looked at photographs of those pages and felt something that had nothing to do with theory. They were looking at a man's attempt to find a language for the deepest and most frightening and most insistent thing inside him. And the language he had found was beautiful. But we are still in the years of its making, still in those years between the break with Freud and the slow consolidation that would follow. The years when the Red Book was being written and painted and kept hidden and worked on by a man who was not yet sure what it was or what it would become, or whether it was the evidence of a great mind working at its highest pitch, or the evidence of something gone badly wrong. He held both possibilities at once. That, perhaps, was itself a kind of courage, not the courage that knows it will come through, but the courage that does not know and continues anyway. He had said something to himself in those years that he would hold to like a handhold on a rock face. He was a husband and a father. He had patients who depended on him. Real people with real suffering who came to his consulting room in Snacht and needed him to be present and lucid and capable. Whatever was happening in the inner world, whatever the descent was asking of him, he could not disappear into it entirely. He would not let himself. He planted this refusal like a stake in the ground at the entrance to the interior, and he kept returning to it, kept returning to the ordinary life as a kind of anchor and proof that he was still here, still functional, still on the surface of things, even while he dove. The evening sessions ended when the evening ended. The family was there, the children's voices, Emma's steady, intelligent presence, the smell of food. The ordinariness of a house by a lake in Switzerland, where time moved as time always moves, breakfast to supper, season to season, the lake changing colours with the light and the weather, as lakes do, regardless of what any particular man is going through in the room above its shore. He kept his morning appointments. He read widely. He had always read widely, medicine and philosophy and mythology and literature and religion, but now he was reading with a more specific hunger, following threads that the inner material kept pulling him toward. He was reading alchemy, the old Hermetic texts, and finding in them images that matched what he had been seeing in the visions. He was reading the Gnostic texts, the early Christian heresies with their strange cosmologies and their sense that the visible world was only a surface over something else. He was reading comparative religion, following myths across cultures, looking for the patterns that kept recurring regardless of geography or history. Because the patterns were there. He kept finding them. In a Norse saga and a Pueblo ceremony and a patient's dream and an Egyptian papyrus and a medieval alchemist's manual, the same figures, the same shapes, the same movements of story. The hero who descends to the underworld and returns transformed, the death and rebirth, the divine child, the old wise teacher at the crossroads, the dangerous feminine, the great shadow, over and over, in forms adapted to different cultures and climates and centuries, something that was recognizably the same structure kept surfacing. And Jung, reading his alchemy and his Gnosticism and his comparative mythology with the visions from the Black Books still vivid in his mind, was developing the theoretical framework that would eventually explain, or at least describe, why this might be. But the framework was not yet built. The concepts were still liquid, still forming. The years of the confrontation with the unconscious were not the years of confident theorizing, they were the years of paying attention, of writing down what came, of drawing the mandalas in the mornings and sitting with Philemon in the evenings and going to see patients and coming home to Emma and the lake and the slow, patient work of the Red Book. He carved things too during this time, on the walls of the house, on stones in the garden. He had always had this impulse, the boy who had carved the mannequin, who had used his hands to make a thing because making it with his hands gave it a different kind of reality than simply thinking it. He inscribed things in stone and felt the resistance of the material under the chisel and found in that resistance something solid to push against. In a world that had become unstable and frightening and full of interior weather, the stone pushed back. The stone was reliably itself. He noted, sometime in these years, looking back at the mannequin from childhood, the little painted figure hidden in the attic pencil case with its painted stone, he noted that what he had done as a boy, making that small secret object, was not meaningless, was not the random behavior of a lonely child. The impulse to create a concrete, physical vessel for something internal and felt. To not just think the important thing, but to make the important thing, to give it a body and a home, that impulse was returning in these adult years in the Red Book and in the inscriptions on stone and in the mandalas. The boy in the attic and the man by the lake were doing. He began to understand. The same thing. They had always been doing the same thing. The distance between the pencil case and the red leather folio was not as great as it seemed. It was the distance between the beginning of a sentence and its end. The black books filled up, pages of visions and dialogues and painted images and the careful noting of what each day had brought up from below. The calligraphic red book received them, transformed, worked over, given the weight and deliberateness of something being made to last. Jung did not know, while he was making it, whether it would last, whether it would ever be seen, whether it would be understood, whether in 20 years he would look back at it as the record of a crisis survived, or as something that had opened into something else entirely. He kept going. There is something to be said for that. For the simple fact of a man who keeps going when he does not know where he is going, who keeps writing down what he sees in the dark, because the alternative, closing his eyes and pretending the dark is not there, seems, to him, worse, more dangerous, in the end, than the descent itself. The wall built against the interior is not protection, it is pressure. The thing you refuse to meet does not dissolve because you refuse to meet it. It waits, it accumulates, and then it arrives at a moment not of your choosing, and with a force you have not prepared for. Jung, at 38, at 39, at 40, was choosing the meeting, was choosing the difficulty now over the worse difficulty later, was going down as deliberately as a diver with the rope in his hand. And in the evenings, by the lamp, the red leather book lay open on the table, and the kingfisher-winged old man with his 4 keys sat in the imagined garden and waited to see what question would come next. The lake outside reflected the stars. The house was quiet. He dipped the pen. What came out of those years was not a system, at first. Systems come later, when the dust has settled and someone sits down with clear eyes and a clean desk and says, "Now let me organize what I have learned." What came out first was simply material. Enormous quantities of it. Images, voices, figures, arguments conducted in the silence of a private imagination between a man and the presences he had decided to take seriously. The Red Book held the raw form of it, the mythological shape, the dreamlike imagery, the paintings that tried to give colour and line to what had no colour and no line in the ordinary world. But alongside the Red Book, alongside the black books that fed it, Jung was also beginning to think, to step back, to ask not just what are these figures, but what do they mean, not for me, privately, but for human beings in general. Is there a pattern here? Is what I am seeing, in my own depths, something that belongs only to me? Or is it something shared? That question became, over the following decades, the engine of his life's work. He began with what he had already found, the idea that, beneath the personal contents of the unconscious, the memories, the disappointments, the repressed wishes that Freud had mapped so carefully, there lay something older, something that did not belong to any individual life, because it had never been an individual life. He called it the collective unconscious. Not a storage room for personal secrets, but a kind of substrate, a layer of the psyche that all human beings share by virtue of being human at all. The way that every human body, no matter where it was born or in what century, has a liver and a heart and a pair of lungs. The collective unconscious, in Jung's theory, was the psychic equivalent, a shared inheritance, ancient beyond the oldest family story, older than language itself. And within it lived what he would call the archetypes. Here the thinking is careful, and it is worth being careful too, because the word archetype travels so far from what Jung actually meant that it becomes almost unrecognizable in its popular uses. He did not mean a character type, a personality slot, a label to apply to people at a dinner party. He meant something more like an organizing pattern, a mold, invisible itself, that shapes what comes out of it. The archetype itself is not an image, it is the tendency to produce certain images, the same images, in cultures and centuries that had no contact with each other. The Great Mother who gives life and takes it away. The wise old man who appears at the edge of the known world and offers a key or a riddle. The trickster who undoes what was carefully made and makes from the ruins something unexpected. The child who appears in dreams at moments of new beginning. The hero who goes into the dark place and comes back changed. Jung had read mythology from many traditions. He had read the Gnostic texts, the alchemical manuscripts, the sacred literature of India, the legends of the indigenous peoples of North America and Africa. And what he kept finding in all of these separate and unconnected traditions was the same shapes wearing different faces. The same story told in different languages by people who had never met. That convergence, he felt, was not coincidence. It was evidence, not proof, but evidence, that the human psyche has a structure, a set of default stories it returns to when it needs to make sense of experience. We inherit not memories, but the patterns by which memories become meaningful. Whether that idea is scientifically provable is a question scholars continue to debate, and it is an honest debate. What is clear is that the idea was extraordinarily generative, that it opened a way of reading human culture that has influenced psychology, literary criticism, anthropology, and religious studies in ways still felt today. And for Jung himself, it was not an abstraction. It was a direct consequence of the years he had spent watching his own unconscious produce figures that felt, to him, not personal, but ancient. Wilhelm had not felt like a piece of Carl Jung. He had felt like something that had existed long before Carl Jung and would exist long after. The archetype theory was Jung's attempt to account for that feeling in terms a doctor could use. Among the archetypes, one deserved special attention because it was also the most uncomfortable. He called it the shadow. The shadow is the part of ourselves we have refused, the qualities we have looked at and said, "Not me. I am not that." The cowardice we do not acknowledge in ourselves, but recognize with great certainty in others. The pettiness we deny having, but see clearly in the person at the next table. The rage, the selfishness, the cruelty, all the things we have tucked away in the dark because we built our self-image on not being those things. The shadow is not evil, exactly. It is simply unlived. It is the room in the house we will not open. And here is the problem Jung kept naming. What you will not open does not cease to exist. The shadow materials do not dissolve because we refuse to claim them. They go underground. They find their way out as projections we see in the person. We hate the very qualities we have most vigorously denied in ourselves. We see in the enemies of our group the evil we have most carefully buried in our group's history. The shadow, projected outward, becomes the shape of everything wrong with the world that is never wrong with us. Integration, not suppression, that was Jung's prescription. Not the performance of virtue over the buried darkness, but the slow, honest work of looking at what is there, claiming what is yours, not to become the shadow, but to cease being unconsciously run by it. The person who has looked steadily at their own capacity for meanness is less likely to find it exploding sideways into their life at an inconvenient moment, wearing a disguise they did not choose. This idea, too, was not abstract for Jung. It came directly from the years of descent, from the things he had found in his own depths that he would not have chosen to find. The confrontation with the unconscious had not been uniformly beautiful. There had been things that alarmed him in there. And the decision to look at them rather than flee from them, to say, yes, this too is mine, was itself an act of the work he would spend decades describing to others. Then there were the anima and the animus, the contra-sexual figure in the psyche, the feminine presence in a man's inner world, the masculine presence in a woman's. In Jung's theory, a man carries within him an image of the feminine that is partly formed by his mother, partly by his culture, partly by that deep archetypal inheritance, and this inner image, the anima, colours how he sees and responds to women in the outer world, sometimes in ways he has never examined. The woman he falls for instantly, without quite knowing why, the irrational pull or the irrational rejection. The anima is often behind it, acting like a lens that tints everything it looks through. The animus performs the same role for a woman, shaping her relationship to authority, to argument, to her own thinking. These were not fully comfortable ideas either. They have been criticized, and the criticism has some justice. The typology reflects the assumptions of Jung's era and culture in ways that have not aged uniformly well. But the underlying intuition that we carry inner figures of the other, that our projections in love and in conflict are shaped by something we have not examined and perhaps have never consciously formed, remains a live one in how people think about intimate life. And then there was the persona, the word he borrowed from the Latin for the mask an actor wore in the ancient theatre, because every person wears one, whether they know it or not. The face we present to the world, competent, agreeable, socially fluent, which is real and is ours, but is not all of us. The danger the persona poses, in Jung's view, is not that it exists, but that we forget it is a mask. That we come to believe we are entirely what we present. That the face we show at the conference table or the dinner party is the whole story. When that happens, the rest of the person, the unlived parts, the shadow contents, the buried capacities, grows restless in the dark. All of these concepts, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the shadow, the anima and animus, the persona, orbited a central idea that Jung considered the most important of all. He called it individuation. The word means, simply, becoming individual, but he meant something more specific and more arduous by it. He meant the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self into something more whole, not perfect, not finished, whole in the sense that the parts are acknowledged rather than disowned, that the tensions between them are held rather than pretended away. And he noticed something about when this process tended to become urgent. It was often not in youth. Youth had its own tasks, establishing an identity, finding a place in the world, building a life. The first half of life was outward work, vocation, family, social role. But somewhere in middle age, the architecture began to feel insufficient. The achievements that were supposed to satisfy did not quite satisfy. The personality that had been so carefully constructed to succeed in the outer world started to feel, at moments, like a costume. And a different question began to press, not who am I to the world, but who am I? That, for Jung, was the invitation of the second half of life, not a crisis to be managed, but an initiation to be undertaken. The invitation to go inward, to do the work of individuation, to begin to integrate what had been left behind in the busy years of outward building. The shadow, the anima or animus, the unlived life, the quiet voice that had been saying, for years, something different from what the persona was saying aloud. He was speaking, partly, from experience. The break with Freud, the years of dissent, the Red Book, these had been, for him, the beginning of his own individuation. the stripping away of the Crown Prince identity, the professional community, the certainties of the movement he had belonged to. What was left, when all of that was gone, was a man alone with himself. And what that man found in himself became, over decades of elaboration, a map for others. In 1921, he published Psychological Types. It was the first major theoretical work of his post-Freud career, and it codified something he had noticed both in his clinical work and in the long division with Freud himself. People seemed to differ, fundamentally and stably, in their orientation to experience. Some people were energized by the outer world, by company, by action, by engagement with what was visible and tangible. He called this extraversion. Others found their center of gravity in the inner world, in reflection, in their own thought and feeling, in solitude. Introversion, and within these two orientations he described 4 functions. The ways in which consciousness processes experience, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. The typology was intended as a theoretical map, a way of understanding why people who were both intelligent and well-intentioned could see the same situation in completely irreconcilable ways. It was partly an attempt to explain, in psychological terms, why he and Freud had been so constitutionally unable, in the end, to share a framework. Different types inhabiting the same world, finding different worlds. What happened to Jung's typology afterward is one of the stranger ironies of his legacy. In the 1940s, an American woman named Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother Catherine Cook Briggs adapted Jung's categories into a personality assessment that would eventually become the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a framework Jung himself had nothing to do with and would likely have regarded with some ambivalence. It is now among the most widely administered psychological instruments in the world. The concepts of introvert and extrovert, which Jung carefully defined as orientations of psychic energy, entered everyday language so thoroughly that they long ago ceased to feel like technical terms at all. They are simply words people use to explain themselves at parties. Jung, who was notoriously skeptical of reducing living human beings to categories, might have found this quietly funny. He was also thinking about coincidence. Or rather, about the moments, the ones most people notice and then dismiss as merely strange, when the outer world and the inner world seem to be saying the same thing at the same time. You think of a friend you have not thought of in years, and the telephone rings. You dream of a blue bird and find one dead on the step in the morning. You read the word you were about to say in a book you have never opened before. Fringe experiences, most would say. Confirmation bias, the human brain finding patterns in noise. Jung was not so sure. He was not claiming supernatural causation. He was claiming that causality, the mechanical sequence of cause and effect that science uses to explain everything, might not be the only organizing principle in nature. He proposed, carefully, the existence of what he called synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence. A coincidence that could not be explained causally, but that seemed to carry significance, to be structured by meaning rather than by mechanism. He worked on this idea with Wolfgang Pauli, the Austrian physicist, who was then developing some of the foundations of quantum mechanics and who was, personally, in a state of psychological crisis that had brought him to Jung's doorway. Pauli dreamed extraordinarily, systematically, and the two men corresponded for years, the physicist and the psychologist, exploring the territory between their two disciplines, where the behavior of the very small seemed to strain the classical assumptions of cause and effect. Jung and Pauli published jointly in 1952 a volume in which each contributed an essay, Pauli on Johannes Kepler's archetypal images of the universe, Jung on synchronicity. Whether synchronicity is a genuine phenomenon, a psychological one, or a systematic misinterpretation of probability remains genuinely contested. But the conversation between those two men, the physicist and the depth psychologist, each approaching the frontier of what their discipline could explain and finding the other there, is itself one of the more remarkable intellectual encounters of the 20th century. Jung was also a traveller, not for recreation exactly, but as a form of research. He needed to see the psyche in contexts outside European civilization, needed to know whether what he was finding in the consulting rooms of Zurich and Snacht was universal or local. In 1924 and 1925, he traveled to the American Southwest, spending time with the Pueblo people of Taos in New Mexico. The conversations he had there, particularly with a man named Biano, affected him deeply. The Pueblo perspective, that the sun was their father and that they performed their rituals not merely as religious practice but as a cosmic duty, as the work that kept the world in its proper motion, was so far from the assumptions of the European mind that it forced him to see those assumptions from the outside for the first time. He returned, convinced that Western civilization had traded something of the soul for its technical mastery of the world, and was only beginning to understand what had been lost. In 1925 and 1926, he went to East Africa, to the slopes of Mount Elgon in what is now Kenya, and lived for a time with people of the Elgoni. Rising early, watching the sunrise from that vast landscape, he felt something he described as almost unbearably primal, the sense of a world not yet divided between inner and outer, psyche and nature, the dreamer and the dream. And then in 1938 he travelled to India, where the philosophical traditions had, over millennia, developed extraordinarily sophisticated maps of interior experience. He moved through those traditions with deep curiosity and with an equally deep reluctance to simply adopt them. He felt that a European needed to find a European path inward, that grafting an Eastern framework onto a Western psyche without the cultural roots that gave it life was its own kind of evasion. He found those roots, partly, in alchemy. This was perhaps his most unexpected turn. Beginning in the 1920s and continuing for decades, Jung immersed himself in the alchemical literature of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Those dense, strange, illustrated manuscripts in which men in dark workshops described their attempts to transmute base metals into gold through obscure processes involving mercurial fluid and a philosophical stone. To most readers, a historical curiosity at best, a form of proto-chemistry at worst. To Jung, a revelation. Because the alchemists, he noticed, were not only talking about metals. They were talking about something happening inside themselves. The language they used, the nigredo, the darkening and dissolution, the albedo, the whitening and clarifying, the rubedo, the reddening and completion, was, if you read it carefully, the language of an inner journey. The lead that became gold was not only lead. The philosopher's stone was not only a stone. The alchemists had projected their psychological processes onto matter and described them in the language of chemistry because they had no other language available to them. Because the interior had not yet been named in the way it would later be named. Jung read their texts as the earliest Western attempts to describe individuation, a secret map of the soul written in the code of a trade. He spent years decoding that map. The work resulted in some of his densest and most demanding writing, Mysterium Conjunctionis, published in 1955 and 1956, the great summing up of his alchemical studies, a book he completed in his 80s and considered the culmination of his theoretical work. But the alchemy was not merely scholarly. It gave him a tradition, a lineage, a sense that what he was doing had roots in his own civilization, however deeply buried. That the descent into the interior was not a foreign import or an idiosyncratic madness, but an ancient practice, hiding in plain sight in the libraries of Europe, waiting for someone to read it correctly. And all the while, alongside the writing and the theorizing and the travelling and the clinical work, the patients who came to Xnacht from across the world, the younger analysts he trained, and the institute he helped found in Zurich in 1948, there was Bollingen. He had bought the land in 1922, a piece of shoreline on the upper lake of Zurich, in the village of Bollingen, and in 1923 he began to build. Not to commission a building, not to describe to an architect what he wanted and wait while others worked. He built it himself, with his own hands, stone by stone. The first structure was a single round tower, modest, primitive by any standard, but exactly what he wanted, a place that looked and felt ancient, that had no concession to modern convenience, that asked something of the person who lived in it. There was no electricity, for much of its life, no running water either. He hauled water from a well, he cut wood and laid fires and cooked over flame. He lit oil lamps at night, he carved inscriptions into the stone, quotations, symbols, images that mattered to him, and painted figures on the walls. Over the next 3 decades he added to it, expanding it in 1927, in 1931, in 1935. Each addition a response to something that had changed in him or was changing. The tower grew with him like a building built by a tree. He called it a place where he could be what he named his no-two self, the one beneath the professor, the theorist, the public figure. At Bollingen there was no telephone, no schedule, no professional role to perform. There was stone and water and firelight and the lake. There was silence deep enough to hear himself think. There was, in the evenings, the particular quality of stillness that comes when a place has no artificial light and the dark is simply dark, the stars simply stars, and the water of the lake moves the way water has always moved, without asking anything of the person watching it. He worked there with his hands as much as with his mind. He cooked and gardened and carved and stacked wood and rode the lake and walked the paths he knew well enough to walk in the dark. He described the tower as a kind of confession, a building that said something about who he was more honestly than any public statement could. He used the word maternal for it, once, a maternal hearth, a place not of achievement, but of being, of the kind of rest that comes not from stopping, but from doing the things that give rest, the physical, the elemental, the slow. Emma came to Bollingen with him, and the children, and later the grandchildren. Emma, who had been there from the beginning, from the young doctor at the Bergulzli, from the early Freud years, from the years of crisis and Red Book and all that followed. Emma, who had never simply been a supportive presence in the background of a great man's story, but had been thinking and writing and working in her own right, had become an analyst herself, had spent years on a study of the Grail legend, had written on the anima and animus in ways that extended and sometimes quietly corrected her husband's thinking. They had lived a long life together, complicated and deep and full of the kind of history that accumulates between two people over 50 years. She died in 1955. She was 73. Jung was 80. He returned to Bollingen after her death and built the final upper chamber of the tower, the last edition, the one that completed it. He built it in memory of her, though he never said so publicly. The tower's completion and Emma's death arrived together. And perhaps that is what it means. Not that one caused the other, but that they belong to the same moment of a life. The late moment when everything that was going to be built has been built, and what remains is to inhabit it fully. The Red Book, that red leather folio, hand-lettered and hand-painted, the record of the years when he did not know if he was going mad or finding his way, stayed in a bank vault in Zurich. It stayed there through the Bollingen years, through the founding of the Institute, through the travels and the alchemical studies and the publications and the honorary degrees. Jung showed it to very few people. He had never published it and seemed, in the ordinary sense, undecided about whether he ever would. Perhaps the question was whether the thing needed to be published, whether what it said had already been said in a different register in his theoretical writing, and the original would only confuse. Perhaps he was simply not ready to let people see in full the raw material of those years. He died without having published it. Carl Gustav Jung died at his home in Snacht on the 6th of June 1961. He was 85 years old. The house sat on the lake as it always had, and the water moved outside the windows, as water does. There is a story, unverifiable, belonging to the category of things that may be true or may be exactly the right thing for people to need to say, that around the time of his death, lightning struck a favourite poplar tree in his garden. His colleagues and friends reported it. Whether it happened precisely that way, or whether the story grew as stories grow around a life that invites them, belongs to what we cannot settle. It has the feeling, at least, of something his own interior world would have recognized. The meaningful coincidence. The outer world and the inner saying the same thing at the same moment in a language that was not exactly either. The memoir he had been working on with his colleague Aniela Jaff was published the following year in 1962, Memories, Dreams. Reflections, it shaped, more than any other single text, how the public would come to understand Jung. It is a book full of the images that have followed him ever since, the carved mannequin in the pencil case, the forbidden vision above the cathedral, the 13-hour conversation with Freud, the years of dissent, Philemon in the garden, the tower by the lake. It reads as a life remembered not chronologically but mythologically, the way a person late in life reaches back and finds that certain moments have acquired a weight and a shape they did not have at the time. It is a beautiful book, and scholars are right to remind us that it is also a curated one, that Aniela Jaff shaped the material, that Jung himself chose what to include and how to frame it, that the life in its pages is a consciously wrought self-portrait and not a neutral transcript of events. Both things are true. It is crafted, and it is in its crafting profoundly revealing of how Jung chose to understand his own life, which is itself a kind of truth. The Red Book waited another 4 decades. In 2009, almost 50 years after Jung's death, a scholar named Sonu Shamdasani finally brought it to publication. A large, extraordinary volume, reproducing the pages as Jung had made them, the medieval script, the paintings, the illuminated borders, the figures Jung had found in the dark years and given form with his own hands. It arrived into a world that was not quite prepared for it and did not quite know what to do with it, which may have been appropriate. It was not a book you could read quickly or file neatly. It was an artifact, a record of a private journey undertaken by a man who was simultaneously a scientist and a visionary, a clinician and a mythmaker, a rationalist who had agreed to take the irrational seriously and had spent years alone in the company of what he found there. Reading it, you are aware of something that the theoretical works do not quite give you, the texture of the actual experience. The nights, the lamp, the quality of attention required to sit with something vast and strange and frightening and continue to ask it questions. The painted figures look out from the pages with an intensity that belongs entirely to the moment of their making. A man in a crisis of his life, putting paint on parchment by lamplight, trying to find out who was in there. And now, this late in the telling, it is worth stepping back a little, settling into the quiet of where we have arrived, because what is the shape of this life, seen whole? A boy born on the shore of a lake, in a house where the inner world was always present, through the father's quiet loss of faith, through the mother's uncanny alternate self, through the seances held in the parlour, through the thundering waterfall that was the sound of his earliest months. A boy who carved a small figure and hid it in an attic and told no one, who read a textbook preface in his final year of medical school and felt, with a certainty that surprised him, that he had found what he was looking for, who arrived at a clinic on a December night in 1900 and began to listen, really listen, with instruments and patience, to what people could not quite say, to what their hesitations and their stumbles and the sweat on their skin was trying to say for them. Who met a man in Vienna in 1907 and talked with him for 13 hours, and felt for a while that he had found not only a teacher, but a home, a community of minds who were willing to take the interior seriously, and who then found that the home could not hold him, that the framework was too small for what he thought he was finding, that loyalty in a living mind has its limits, and that the cost of exceeding those limits was everything he had built in that world. The crown prince without a kingdom, at 40, looking at the ruin of his professional life and choosing, rather than rebuilding on familiar ground, to go somewhere he had not been. Into himself. Down the years of descent. The Red Book, made in secret, held in secret, expressing the conviction that what he was doing there mattered, even if it could not yet be explained. The slow emergence from that period into the work that would define the rest of his life, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the shadow, the long task of individuation. The travels to New Mexico and East Africa and India, each one an attempt to understand his own ideas by seeing them from the outside. The decades of writing, the institute, the patients, the students, the long marriage to Emma, who was also doing her own work, thinking her own thoughts, adding her own chapters to a life they had built together. And always, through all of it, Bollingen, the tower. The stone laid on stone with his own hands, the fire, the well, the lamp, the lake. The place where the no-to self, the older, deeper, quieter self that preceded all the theory and survived all the accolades, could simply be, could sit with the water and the dark and the weight of the decades and know that this, underneath everything, was what it came down to. The quiet, the continuity, the sense that the interior life, however long the journey into it, was not a destination but a direction, not a problem to solve, but a territory to inhabit, carefully, for as long as one was given. He sat in that tower in his 80s, in the years after Emma died, and completed his final great work, and carved his last inscriptions into stone, and watched the lake the way he had watched lakes since, before he could put words to what he was seeing. The same water in a different light after a different number of years. It is a peculiar thing what the life of Carl Gustav Jung seems to want to say to us from this distance. It is not exactly a success story, or not only. It is the story of a man who discovered, at great cost, that the thing he needed most to understand was himself, and who then, against the warnings of professional safety and the attractions of existing frameworks, actually undertook that understanding. Who kept going down when the easier thing would have been to come back up and report something tidier? Who spent years in the company of inner figures that he took seriously enough to dialogue with and paint and letter into a book, while not entirely forgetting that he was also a doctor with a medical degree and a responsibility to the people who sat across from him in his consulting room. The ideas that came from all of that, contested, influential, imprecise in places, astonishing in others, live on in ways he could not have anticipated. The words introvert and extrovert are used by people who have never heard of Carl Jung and might not particularly care. The shadow has entered the language of popular psychology in forms he would probably barely recognize. The archetype turns up in film theory and literary criticism and marketing and organizational psychology. The Myers-Briggs questionnaire, with its very loose descent from his typology, has been completed by millions of people in corporate training rooms around the world. And in small consulting rooms, analysts trained in the tradition he founded still sit in the silence with people who have come to work on the parts of themselves they have not yet been willing to name. The Red Book sits in an archive. The tower stands at Bollingen on the upper lake, stone on stone, exactly as he built it. The lake reflects whatever weather the season brings, grey in winter, green in summer, black on clear nights when the stars are out and the world is quiet. He was a man who believed, more than almost anything else, that the interior life was real, that the things that happened inside a person, the dreams, the visions, the unsayable feelings, the sense of a presence just at the edge of the known, were not symptoms of something wrong, but invitations to something deeper. That to take the inner world seriously was not madness, but a form of courage, and that to refuse it was not sanity, but a different kind of risk. He spent his whole life saying so, from the pencil case in the attic to the tower on the lake. From the moment he read a textbook preface and felt his whole future reorganize itself around a single certainty, to the June afternoon in 1961, when the poplar in the garden was struck by something. Lightning, the story says, and perhaps the story is right, and a man who had been going inward for 85 years went somewhere it is not given to us to follow. He would have had something to say about that too, some thought about the threshold, the passage, the crossing of the boundary between what we can know and what we can only move toward. Something careful, earned, full of a lifetime's particular kind of attention. But that belongs to the silence now, and the silence is what we have come to, finally. The whole long arc of it settling into the quiet of this hour, the Rhine falls of infancy and the lake of old age, the 12-year-old boy in the attic with his secret figure, the doctor at the Bergulzli with his stopwatch and his list of words, the man who painted his own visions into a red leather book and locked them away and kept going, the builder of a tower by hand. The theorist of a soul he had first had to find his own way into, in the dark, alone, without a map, because he was the one, in the end, making the map. The lake is still. The tower stands. The book was published and the ideas went out into the world, and the world used them in ways he did not always intend, which is how it always goes. And somewhere in all of this, if you have followed the story to its end, you may have noticed something quiet happening. A kind of settling, a kind of recognition. The feeling that the territory he was describing was not, actually, foreign, that you too have a room you do not always open. A figure you sometimes glimpse at the edge of the inner world. a sense at the right hour that the person you present to the day is not the only person in there. That recognition is the oldest one. He did not invent it, he just spent a lifetime trying to give it its proper name. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.